Howdy. I'm Jacob Kramer, and this is the second episode of the Philosophy Forum Q&A. Today I have a question from Ken Valario. Now, Ken has just asked me to talk about the consequences of rapid content inflation. So there wasn't any elaboration on that, but I'm going to try to wade in a little bit. Now, I think what he's talking about is the excess of media that's being produced on the web right now. We've definitely entered into what people talk about as being an attention economy, which means that there's even less attention than there was before to go around. So Ken has asked me to talk about the consequences of rapid content inflation. Oh, wow. Okay. I'm probably going to need a notepad. Okay, so let's start by thinking about the different ways in which Ken could be talking about content rapidly inflating. Okay, so I think there's three main sources that we could break this down into. So I think that some of this inflation that Ken is alluding to is coming from there being more people producing art of every kind than there ever has been before. Maybe this is just an economic thing. Maybe it's kids being lazy and getting artistic. I don't know. A second thing is the way in which social media has kind of destroyed the top-down filters that have existed for art, from things like having a canon of literature, or the process by which you would submit to a board of a magazine, for example, to get an essay published. And there's some idea that they're experts who are going to decide whether or not your content can get out there. But with social media, everyone can simply spam their shit all over the internet. And the third thing is the possibilities that are emerging with new AI and technology, which are making art incredibly easy to produce, especially with the imaging softwares like DALL-E right now. You can just type in a few words and pop out a painting, which would have been considered very saleable even just last year. So I think it would be good to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we used to not have content inflation. I can't help but think that one of the reasons was what I talked about before with magazines and editorial boards, is that there used to be much more of a selective process, it seems. And it was more hierarchical and less populist. Also, I'm most familiar with literature, and, the literary canon was a very narrowing tool. So the idea is, of course, that you could read a single bookshelf, maybe 100 books, and that you'd be getting the best of thousands of years of literature. Now, postmodernism has a lot to say about why that's bullshit, but there is something to the idea of a classic. Anyone who has gone through those 100 bookshelves knows that you're getting something much better than what you would find just on average with a room of 100 random books. On the other hand, we're dealing with a proliferation of content today, which can be done at an extraordinarily high caliber. And so it's not as if we have a lot of clear losers with a few winners in the art world. It's like we have winner after winner in competition with each other, and there's so much good content being produced at any time. I mean, I guess some people can make the argument that it's all cheap these days, but I don't think that's honestly the case. I think the cheapening process that we're sensing actually comes from this issue of there being too much. Part of the issue has to be that we're limited in our processing capabilities. And so when there's too much culture out there, it's like we can't connect to each other. I mean, one of the benefits of having a single religious culture, let's say, like having a Christian culture, is that everyone can talk about the same stories from the Bible and they'll be on the same page. They have a shared mythology. And I think that a lot of our issues these days come from the sense that we have no shared mythos. It seems that with the algorithm, one of the consequences of all of this content is that each person has been drawn into their little corner of personality. And so, well, not just personality, there's a personal aspect, but now I think we're starting to also see a tribal aspect. it's interesting how the tribal developed after the personal, it seems, but it was like everything was broken into atoms, and now we're going into tribes again. So it's as if maybe in the past there was a notion of excellence and of cultural excellence, and that this was the kind of objective thing that you were taught, that culture should be built around these great works which are really transpersonal. And these days, there's more of a sense with the vast proliferation of culture that we have, that the algorithm and just your own freedoms are taking you into your own corner where your personality is the most like itself and where you don't have to hear anything else about other people. I think there's something very scary about that. And now we're seeing this tribal phenomenon as well, where people are finding these corners of information too. And so there's just this immensity, there's an immense lack of shared ground. I mean, it's well known that you can't look at your YouTube page or your Facebook page and say what's going on in the world now, because to some large extent, the mainstream has been fragmented. And so what you're being shown is curated very specifically for you. So the information limiting is going on. So in a sense, the proliferation of the culture is not the main issue. The amount of media being produced is not necessarily the biggest issue, because there is information reduction going on. It's just being performed by the algorithm catering to your personality and basic desires. I mean, we could imagine a world in which there was not as much media being produced, but where the algorithm was still operating as it does. And in that case, you would still be led to this little corner. It feels as if we're in want of better selection processes. Well, maybe the first thing I should have said is that a lot of people are going to be out of jobs. The consequences of rapid content inflation. Fuck you, Ken. This is a hard question. I guess the thing I just keep coming back to when I think about the consequences of content inflation is that it's married to this issue of information selection and reduction. And it seems to me that the biggest thing that we're looking for is something that can cut across or pierce through both the personal and the tribal levels of information reduction. It's something which is more genuinely human. I mean, the value of the content will have to decrease just on the basis of its scarcity being reduced. What was once a great piece of artwork will become a common piece of artwork. I just was reminded, another metaphor that I had thought of a long time ago for this was that it feels as if for a long while we were in an agricultural mode of knowledge, where there was kind of certain crops that were dependable and that you would feed your population on, and you wouldn't have to move around very much. And it was pretty linear. And it seems as if now we're transforming into a hunter-gatherer form of education or cultural nurturance, where it's like you're walking around from place to place and picking off random fruits and vegetables from the trees, which are very disjointed. So you can, read an Arabian text tonight, you can read Shakespeare tomorrow, and then you can watch Megan Thee Stallion perform WAP. So I think one of the basic consequences that we'll see, and I think we're beginning to see, and maybe this is partly the loyalism which is cropping up, is we'll see very rudimentary forms of information reduction. And also, as things seem to get a little bit tenser in the world, we're seeing many intellectuals start to defend the ideas of nationalism again and returns to cultural roots, which is a kind of hilarious thing in the face of all of this information to say that was the best way. But maybe it's interesting in a way when I think about it, that there will be these tribalist elements who have access to millennia-old cultural networks. So the people who are nationalists, are Christians or whatever, can go and completely limit their knowledge to the study of the history of that culture. And they'll be left with a pretty sophisticated framework for living and for information reduction. And on the other hand, of course, there's going to be the inexorable expansion and conflation with all of the other cultures that exist. And it feels as if there'll probably be a steep competition until the point is reached when, I guess, for lack of a better word, what we could call the globalists come up with a solution which is superior, clearly superior to that retrogressive stance. I think it also brings media production much closer to the world of action. It feels as if writing a book is more like speaking now, because you're not writing something that you necessarily believe is going to endure forever. You're writing something which is really in the flow of time. And so it is like other actions, and people consume it as food. They don't necessarily worship it as a holy idol. And I don't necessarily think that's all bad. I mean, there has maybe been a kind of tyranny of artifacts that we've lived under, and it's nice to know that they'll be entering time. There's something kind of zen about that, to think that a great book or art piece will now be something that you consume and let go on its way, and life flows on. One interesting consideration is that an algorithm could be produced which has different directives than leading us into the own corners of our personality. An algorithm could be produced whose primary aim was to create information reduction to bring about social harmony, so that there was, once again, a shared story. Now, I don't know. I don't have any clue what the parameters of that could be, but it seems that could be a way forward. In the meanwhile, I think a lot of people are going to be going crazy.